In the dying days of the Old Republic, when 10,000 years of galactic civilization began to crumble beneath the weight of endless war, there existed a truth that the Jedi feared to speak aloud. Deep within the toxic minds of a forgotten world, a nameless slave discovers a power that should have remained buried forever. On the blood-soaked battlefields of Ruusan, 1,000 Dark Lords gather their strength for one final, cataclysmic strike. In the shadows between stars, two figures forge a conspiracy that will echo across a millennium, invisible, patient, waiting. But how does one man destroy an entire order of Dark Lords to save them? How does the weakest become the strongest? How does death become the ultimate path to immortality? This is the chronicle of Darth, Bane, warrior, destroyer, creator, the architect of shadows who reshaped the galaxy through a single devastating truth. One master, one apprentice, two who would become legion. Tonight we journey through fire and darkness, through betrayal and rebirth, through three epic tales that span decades of secrets, sacrifice, and the terrifying price of ultimate power. From the cortosis mines of Apatros to the forbidden tombs of Korriban, from the thought bomb that consumed hundreds to the final duel that proved the rule of two eternal. Tonight we explore the complete Darth Bane trilogy. The legendary Sith Lord whose vision of power through secrecy and patience created a lineage that would eventually topple the Republic itself, a story of ruthless ambition, dark wisdom, and the unbreakable will to survive. Now, here's something fascinating. About 62% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars lore, that subscribe button really helps this channel grow and bring you more epic stories like this. I'd love to know where in the galaxy you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment and let me know. It's amazing to connect with fellow Star Wars fans across different time zones and countries. So dim the lights, get comfortable under your blanket, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin this journey together into the shadows of the Sith. 1,000 years before the fall of the Republic, before the rise of the Galactic Empire, before the name Skywalker would echo through history, the galaxy burned in the fires of the new Sith Wars. For a millennium, the Brotherhood of Darkness and the Army of Light had waged endless conflict across 100 worlds. Entire star systems had been reduced to ash. Civilizations that had stood for 10,000 years crumbled in mere decades. The Jedi and Sith, locked in eternal struggle, had forgotten why they fought. They only knew that they must. But this is not their story, not yet. Our tale begins in a place far from the grand battles and legendary heroes, in the Outer Rim territories, on a world called Apatros, where the air itself could kill you and every breath tasted of metal and poison. This was a mining world, a prison without bars, a place where men came to dig cortosis from the deep places of the earth, and where most would die in darkness, forgotten by the galaxy above. In the deepest shafts of the ORO Company mines, where the heat was unbearable and the air thick with toxic dust, the miners worked like the machines that surrounded them. 14-hour shifts, 7 days a cycle. Every credit earned immediately consumed by company debts for food, lodging, equipment, a system designed to ensure that once you arrived on Apatros, you would never leave. Among these condemned souls labored a young man named Dessel, broad-shouldered, scarred, with eyes that burned with barely suppressed rage. His father Hurst had brought him to this place as a child. That same father who beat him regularly, who blamed him for his mother's death, who reminded him daily that he was worthless, destined for nothing but a life underground. But Hurst was wrong. Dessel possessed something the other miners did not. Something he himself did not fully understand. When the anger came, when the rage built inside him like pressure in the deep mines, impossible things happened. Support beams that should have collapsed held firm, when Desil willed them to stand. Equipment that malfunctioned for others worked perfectly in his hands, and in the brutal fistfights that erupted regularly among the miners, Desil never lost, not once. He moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. He anticipated attacks before they came, and when he struck, men twice his size fell like children. The other miners feared him, whispered about him, stayed clear when his temper rose, all except one. Groshek owned the cantina, where the miners gathered after their shifts. A weathered old man with sharp eyes that saw more than most. He recognized something in Desil that the young man did not yet see in himself. Potential, power, destiny. It was in Groshek's cantina that everything changed. The Sabak games were legendary on Apatras, high-stakes, dangerous players, and violence that erupted as regularly as the volcanic vents that dotted the planet's surface. Desil had a gift for the game. The same instinct that saved his life in the mines served him well at the Sabak table. He could sense the cards before they turned, could read opponents without conscious thought, could manipulate probability itself through sheer force of will. On the night that sealed his fate, a Republic ensign sat across from Desil, young, arrogant, backed by 5 soldiers who lounged nearby with weapons ready. The ensign had already lost considerable credits, and his temper had grown sharp with each hand. The tension in the cantina thickened. Other miners backed away from the table. They had seen this before, knew how it would end. When Desil won the final hand, when he reached across the table to claim his winnings, the ensign's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Accusations of cheating, threats of arrest. The soldiers moved forward, hands on weapons. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Desil felt the familiar rage build inside him, but this time it exploded outward with a force he had never experienced. The ensign's grip shattered. Literally, every bone in his hand crushed by invisible pressure as the officer screamed and reached for his blaster. Desil's hand moved with supernatural speed. The vibroblade from his belt found the ensign's throat before the man could draw his weapon. Silence crashed over the cantina like a physical force. The Republic ensign collapsed, blood pooling across the Sabak table, credits scattered in crimson puddles. The soldiers stood frozen, shocked by the sudden violence. The other miners stared at Desil with new understanding. He had killed a Republic officer on a Republic-controlled world. There was only one punishment for that: death. Desil ran through the mining complex, past the HAB units, into the toxic wastelands that surrounded the settlements. Behind him, alarms shrieked into the sulphurous night. Searchlights pierced the darkness. The Republic garrison mobilized with military efficiency. He should have died there. Alone, hunted, on a world that killed unprotected humans within hours. The toxic atmosphere would burn his lungs. The heat would cook him alive. The volcanic vents would consume him. But something else found him first. A ship descended from the sky. Sleek, dangerous, painted in colors that Desil recognized from whispered stories told in the deep mines. Sith colors. The hatch opened and a figure emerged. Tall, cloaked, radiating an authority that made Desil's instincts scream both warning and recognition. The Sith looked at him with eyes that saw through flesh and bone to the power burning underneath. A smile crossed the stranger's face. Not kind, not cruel, simply knowing. You killed that Republic officer without training, without understanding what you are. The voice was smooth, cultured, utterly confident. I watched from the cantina, felt the force explode from you like a star going nova. You have potential, boy. Raw, undisciplined, but vast. Desil stared at the extended hand. Behind him, the Republic soldiers were closing in. Searchlights swept closer. Voices shouted in the darkness. Death approached from every direction. The galaxy is at war, the Sith said. The Brotherhood of Darkness seeks those with your gifts, those willing to embrace their true nature, those strong enough to take what they deserve rather than beg for scraps. The hand remained extended. Come with me to Korriban. Learn what you truly are, or stay here and die forgotten in the toxic mud of this worthless rock. Desil took the hand. Above them, the ship's engines screamed to life. Republic soldiers burst from the settlement, weapons firing, blaster bolts painting lines of light through the sulphurous air, but they were too late. The ship climbed into the night sky, leaving Apatros behind forever, leaving Desil behind forever. The man who would become Darth Bane had taken his first step into darkness, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Valley of the Dark Lord stretched across Korriban like an open wound in the fabric of the Force itself. Ancient tombs carved into red sandstone cliffs, monuments to Sith who had ruled the galaxy when the Republic was young. Naga Sado, Marka Ragnos, Dulak Horde, names that echoed through millennia, their power still palpable in the very air. This was holy ground for the dark side, and it was here that the Brotherhood of Darkness trained their armies. The academy rose from the mountain itself, a fortress of black stone and sharp angles that seemed to reject the dying light of Korriban's sun. Hundreds of students filled its halls. Humans, Twi'leks, Zabraks, beings from across the galaxy who had felt the call of the dark side and answered. They came seeking power. Most would find only death. Desil arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rage that burned hotter than Korriban's desert winds. The Sith who recruited him had spoken only once during the journey. Your old life is gone. Your old name is meaningless. Here you will forge a new identity, or you will be destroyed in the attempt. The first test came within hours of arrival. Lord Cordis, master of the academy, gathered the new students in the main courtyard, a corpulent man whose soft appearance disguised a mind as sharp as any lightsaber blade. He surveyed the assembled candidates with eyes that calculated worth as a merchant calculates profit. The Brotherhood of Darkness offers you power beyond imagination, Cordis announced, his voice carrying across the stone plaza. But power must be earned, proven, taken by force if necessary. He gestured toward the training grounds where dozens of students engaged in brutal combat. The strong will rise. The weak will serve or perish. There is no middle path. Among the assembled students stood a young man who radiated arrogance like others radiated heat. Surak, tall, muscular, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never having been truly challenged. He was the Academy's champion, the strongest of the current students, and he ruled through fear and violence that the instructors not only permitted but encouraged. Basiric's eyes found Desil immediately, recognized something he saw as threat or opportunity, perhaps both. He smiled with all the warmth of a Korriban tomb and made a mental note. The new arrival would need to be broken, soon. But there was another who noticed Desi, a woman of startling beauty, despite the hard edges the dark side had carved into her features. Githany, once a Jedi Padawan who had abandoned the light for reasons she kept locked behind careful smiles and calculated seduction. Her reputation at the Academy was formidable, not for raw power, which she possessed in abundance, but for her ability to manipulate others into serving her purposes while believing it was their own idea. She watched Desil with interest that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with opportunity. A powerful new student, one who clearly despised authority, one whose rage was visible to anyone with eyes to see. Yes, he could be useful. The training began immediately and without mercy. Qasim, the Blade Master, was a Twi'lek of extraordinary skill who had survived battles that destroyed armies. His two lightsabers moved with such fluid grace that watching him was like witnessing a deadly dance. He taught lightsaber combat with a perfectionist's eye and a killer's instinct. Mistakes were corrected once. The same mistake made twice was corrected with permanent injury. Adessel threw himself into training with single-minded intensity that bordered on obsession. While other students slept, he practiced forms until his muscles screamed. While they socialized and formed alliances, he studied ancient texts in the archives. While they celebrated small victories, he pushed himself harder, always seeking the next level of power. And the power came. In combat drills, his instincts proved nearly supernatural. He could sense attacks before they developed, counter moves that hadn't yet been made, exploit weaknesses his opponents didn't know they possessed. The force flowed through him in combat, like water finding cracks in stone, natural and devastating. Qasim noticed, began pulling Dessel aside for private instruction, teaching techniques reserved for the most promising students. The Blade Master saw something familiar in this angry young man, a rejection of the Brotherhood's core philosophy that all Sith were equal, an understanding that some were simply stronger and deserved to rule. The Brotherhood teaches that we are all equal in the dark side, Qasim said during one late-night session, his voice barely above a whisper. Lord Catan believes that by sharing power among many, we become stronger than the Jedi and their rigid hierarchy. He paused, his head-tails twitching slightly. But I remember the old ways, when the Sith were led by the strongest, not by committee. When one Dark Lord commanded, and the rest obeyed or died. These words planted seeds in Dessel's mind that would eventually grow into a philosophy that reshaped the galaxy. But that was still to come. Surak's hatred grew with each of Dessel's victories. The champion saw his position threatened by this newcomer, who refused to show proper deference, who met Surak's challenging stares with cold indifference, who seemed utterly unimpressed by reputation or intimidation. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. Surak engineered a training duel, claiming it would be educational for the other students to watch the champion spar with promising talent. But everyone in the courtyard knew the truth. This was meant to be a humiliation, a lesson about challenging established power. For 10 minutes Dessel held his own. His technique was raw compared to Surak's polished skill, but his aggression and unpredictability kept the champion off balance. The watching students murmured in surprise. No one had lasted this long against Surak in months. Then Surak changed tactics, used the force to hurl Dessel across the courtyard into a stone pillar. Before the younger man could recover, the champion was on him, lightsaber dancing in patterns too fast to follow. Dessel defended desperately, but Surak's superior experience told. A strike to the leg sent Dessel to his knees. A blow to his weapon sent his training saber skittering across the stones. Surak stood over him, Victor's smile plastered across his face. Remember this new blood. Remember who rules this academy. Remember your place. The watching students laughed, all except two. Qasim's expression was thoughtful, calculating. He had seen the potential even in defeat, seen how close Dessel had come to overwhelming a student with years more training. And Githany smiled her secret smile, seeing exactly what she needed. A powerful student, humiliated, burning with need for revenge, perfect raw material for her plans. She approached Dessel that night, as he sat alone, tending his injuries in the shadow of an ancient tomb. Her voice was soft, sympathetic, carefully calculated to sound genuine. "Surak fears you," she said, settling beside him, without asking permission. "That's why he humiliated you publicly. He saw what Qasim sees. What I see, you have more raw power than anyone in this academy. You just lack the training to use it properly." Dessel said nothing, but his attention was complete. "I could help you," Githany continued, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I know techniques the instructors don't teach, secrets I learned before I left the Jedi. Together, We could make you strong enough to crush Serac, to take his place as champion. It was a trap, though Desil didn't know it yet. Githany had no interest in his success, except as it served her own ambitions, but the seeds of alliance were planted. In the archives, Desil began finding restricted texts, documents that questioned the Brotherhood's philosophy, ancient holocrons that spoke of older, purer forms of Sith power, and slowly doubt began to grow. If the dark side grew stronger through passion, through individual power, how could diluting it among thousands of equal practitioners make the Sith stronger? The mathematics didn't work. The philosophy contradicted itself. But these were dangerous thoughts. Heresy against Lord Khan's vision. Thoughts that could get a student executed if spoken aloud. So Desil kept them to himself, trained harder, grew stronger, and planned his revenge against Serac with patience that would have surprised those who only saw his rage. The game was larger than he knew. The pieces were moving into position, and the student who arrived as Desil was slowly becoming someone else entirely. Someone who would change everything. Githany's betrayal came on a night when the twin moons of Korriban cast blood-red shadows across the Valley of the Dark Lords. She had played her role perfectly. Weeks of secret meetings, stolen kisses, whispered promises. She trained with Desil, taught him techniques that made him faster, stronger, more dangerous. They became lovers in the way that Sith become lovers, each using the other while pretending to something deeper. He thought she was his ally, his partner in the coming confrontation with Serac. He was wrong. Serac found him in the archives, where Desil studied late into the night as was his custom. But the champion wasn't alone. 5 of his closest followers surrounded him, and standing among them, face carefully neutral, was Githany. "Did you really think she cared about you?" Serac's voice dripped with contempt. "Did you think a woman like her would want anything from a former minor except a weapon to use against me?" He laughed, and his followers echoed the sound like trained dogs. "She came to me weeks ago, told me everything. Every technique she taught you, every plan you made, all of it." The rage that exploded through Desil should have given him strength, should have let him tap into the dark side with devastating force. Instead, for the first time in his life, the power wouldn't come. Fear had crept into his mind. Fear of betrayal, fear of being used, fear of dying alone in these ancient halls. And fear was the mind killer. They beat him savagely, 6 against 1, using fists and boots and the force itself. Ribs cracked, bones shattered, blood painted the ancient stone floors. When consciousness finally left him, Desil's last thought was that he had been a fool, that he would die as his father had always said he would, alone, worthless, forgotten. But death did not come. He woke in the medical facility, body wrapped in Bacta bandages, pain suppressors barely dulling the agony that radiated from every nerve. Worse than the physical damage was the other wound, the hole where his connection to the Force had been, empty, silent, gone. For a Sith, this was worse than death. To feel the dark side and then lose it was psychological torture beyond description, like going blind after a lifetime of sight, like losing a limb that had always been part of you. The instructors cast him out, sent him to work in the Academy's mines, the place where failed students served out their days in punishment and humiliation. It was a deliberate cruelty, sending him back to the life he thought he'd escaped, proving that he was, as his father had always claimed, worth nothing. In the darkness beneath Korriban's mountains, surrounded by the other failures and broken students, Desil confronted the deepest truth of his existence. Everything he had believed about himself was wrong. His power hadn't come from strength, but from anger so pure it bypassed conscious thought. The moment fear entered his mind, the moment he hesitated, the dark side abandoned him. It was Caleb who found him, an old man broken in body but sharp in mind, who served as healer to the Academy's outcasts. A former Jedi who had fallen to darkness but never quite managed to embrace it fully. He looked at Dessel with eyes that had seen too much and understood more. "You think you lost your power because you were weak?" Caleb said, his voice rough from years of breathing stone dust. "But that's not what happened. You lost it because you were afraid. The dark side feeds on pure emotion, anger, hatred, passion. But fear creates hesitation, creates doubt, and doubt is poison to the Force." Dessel wanted to dismiss the old man's words, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all, but something in Caleb's certainty made him listen. "You have to choose," the healer continued. "Either accept what you are and embrace it completely, without reservation, without fear, or die slowly in these mines. There is no middle ground for someone with your potential." That night, alone in the darkness, Dessel made his choice. He stopped fighting what he was, stopped pretending there was anything in him except the darkness. His father had been right about one thing. He was different, wrong, broken in ways normal people weren't. But instead of weakness, what if that brokenness was actually strength? What if the rage that had defined his entire life wasn't something to control but something to become? The dark side rushed back into him, like a dam breaking, stronger than before. Purer, unfiltered by doubt or hesitation, or the careful control the Academy tried to teach. This was power in its rawest form, terrifying, exhilarating, absolute. When he walked out of those mines, he was no longer Dessel. That name belonged to a boy who sought approval, who wanted to be accepted, who cared what others thought. The man who emerged cared for nothing except power and the will to use it. He returned to the Academy without permission, walked through the halls as students and instructors alike stepped aside, sensing something in him that raised primal warnings in their minds. He found Sirac in the training courtyard, surrounded as always by his followers basking in the admiration of weaker students. The duel that followed entered Academy legend. Sirac was skilled, trained by the best, experienced in combat that had killed dozens, but he faced something he had never encountered before. Someone who didn't fight to win or to prove anything or to gain status. Someone who fought because the violence itself was the point. Dessel's lightsaber moved in patterns that shouldn't have been possible. His command of the Force had transcended technique into pure instinct. When Sirac attacked, the blade was already moving to counter. When Sirac defended, the assault was already coming from a different angle. The champion's followers tried to intervene. Lightning from Dessel's fingertips, uncontrolled and devastating, sent them flying. One student's neck snapped against a pillar. Another screamed as the electricity cooked flesh beneath his robes. The rest fled. In the end, Sirac knelt in the center of the courtyard, his weapon gone, his face twisted in disbelief. He had never lost, never even come close. The idea that someone could so completely dominate him was incomprehensible. Dessel didn't grant mercy or acceptance or anything except the ending that violence always promised. The lightsaber took Sirac's head in a single stroke. Silence crashed over the courtyard like a physical thing. Every student, every instructor, every Force-sensitive being in the Academy felt what had just happened. A line had been crossed. Someone had rejected the Brotherhood's teachings completely and emerged stronger for it. Kazim watched from the shadows with satisfaction warming his features. This was what the Sith should be. What they had been before Kazim's weak philosophy infected them. Githany, standing among the crowd, felt ice water flood her veins. She had created this, used him and betrayed him, and inadvertently forged him into something far more dangerous than she'd intended. Lord Cordis summoned Dessel to his chambers. The headmaster should have executed this student for unsanctioned killing. should have made an example of someone who so blatantly rejected Brotherhood doctrine. Instead, he offered knowledge, pointed him towards something that would change everything. On a world called Lehen, far from any inhabited system, lay a holocron, ancient, powerful, created by someone who had faced the same questions about the nature of Sith power. Darth Revan's holocron. The name meant nothing to most. A Sith Lord from the Jedi Civil War, 300 years dead, his teachings supposedly lost. But Qasim had whispered to Cordis about the old ways, about what this student might become if given the right knowledge at the right moment. And so, without realizing it, the Brotherhood of Darkness set in motion their own destruction. They sent their most dangerous student to find the very philosophy that would unmake everything they had built. The man who boarded the transport to Lehon carried a new name that he had claimed for himself. Bane, a word that meant death and destruction in a dozen languages, a promise of what he would become. The journey to wisdom had begun, and the galaxy would never recover from what he would learn. Lehon hung in space like a forgotten jewel, wreathed in storms that had raged for millennia. Once called Rekata Prime, this world had been the heart of an empire that ruled the galaxy when humanity was still primitive. Now it was ruins and jungle and memories of power that had consumed itself. Bane's ship descended through atmospheric disturbances that would have destroyed lesser craft. The Force guided him, pulling him toward something ancient that called from the planet's surface. In the canopy below, massive predators hunted and died in the endless cycle of a world returned to nature. The ruins of the Rakatan Empire rose from the jungle like broken teeth. The temple stood alone on a peninsula, waves crashing against foundations that had endured for 20,000 years. Its architecture defied human aesthetics, all strange angles and impossible geometries that suggested the Rakata had perceived reality differently than those who came after. The dark side was thick here, palpable, like breathing liquid shadow. Inside the temple's depths, past traps both technological and force-based that had killed treasure hunters for centuries, Bane found what he sought. The holocron was a pyramid of crimson crystal, pulsing with internal light that suggested consciousness. When Bane's hand touched its surface, Darth Revan's gatekeeper appeared, not the man himself, but an echo, a fragment of personality and knowledge preserved beyond death. What Revan taught over the following weeks transformed everything Bane believed about the Sith. The holocron spoke of cycles, how the Sith rose and fell with predictable regularity throughout galactic history, how they always followed the same pattern, gathering power, turning on each other, destroying themselves from within. 1,000 times this had happened. 1,000 times the strongest Sith Lord would emerge victorious, only to be betrayed by ambitious underlings. The Jedi never truly defeated the Sith defeated themselves. Power divided is power diminished, Revan's echo explained, its voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The dark side does not multiply. When shared among many, it dilutes, weakens, becomes something pale compared to what it could be. The alternative was radical, dangerous, brilliant in its simplicity. The rule of two. Always two there should be. No more, no less. One to embody power, one to crave it. The master would teach the apprentice everything, hold back no secrets, prepare them to one day surpass and destroy their teacher. And when that day came, when the apprentice proved stronger, the cycle would continue with the victor taking a new apprentice. Each generation, the Sith would grow stronger, the weak would be culled naturally through this succession. Knowledge would never be lost because the master would be motivated to teach everything, knowing their legacy depended on creating someone capable of killing them. And the galaxy would never see them coming, because instead of armies of dark Jedi announcing their presence, there would be only two, hidden, patient, plotting across generations. It was madness. It was genius. It was the only way the Sith would ever truly survive. But implementing this philosophy meant destroying the Brotherhood of Darkness, every last one of them, and Bane was only one man against thousands. The solution came from the same holocron, buried in lessons about ancient Sith sorcery, the Thought Bomb, a weapon of such terrible power that even the Rakata had forbidden its use. It channeled the Force itself into a weapon that consumed all Force-sensitive beings within its radius, trapping their essences in eternal torment while their bodies simply ceased to exist. The Brotherhood had gathered on Ruusan for a final confrontation with the Jedi's Army of Light. 7 times they had fought on that world. 7 times the battle had proven inconclusive. Lord Kyan had led the Brotherhood to that planet in confidence, expecting to crush the Jedi through overwhelming numbers. Instead, he found himself trapped. Lord Hoth, Master of the Army of Light, had superior tactical position and reinforcements arriving daily. The Brotherhood was slowly being surrounded, worn down, bled dry through attrition. Khan's confidence turned to desperation, and desperate men make fatal mistakes. Bane arrived on Ruusan wearing armor that would ensure his survival. On Deexanthi, the demon moon of Onderon, he had allowed creatures called obelisks to bond with his flesh, living parasites that fed on the dark side. They covered nearly his entire body in an impenetrable shell. They were agony, constant, unending pain that fed his connection to the Force while protecting him from almost any attack, including, he believed, the Thought Bomb's effects. He found Ken's army demoralized, scattered across the caves and forests of Ruusan like animals gone to ground. The Dark Lords, who had seemed so powerful, now bickered like children, each blaming the others for their predicament. Khan himself teetered on the edge of madness, his eyes too wide, his voice too loud, his presence in the Force fractured by stress and fear. Bane played his role with perfect precision. He appeared as a loyal student returning from research, bearing ancient knowledge that could turn the tide. He showed them texts about the Thought Bomb, explained how its power could destroy the Jedi while leaving the Sith unharmed if they properly prepared themselves. It was a lie, of course. The Thought Bomb killed every Force user in range without discrimination, but Kakan was too desperate to question, too eager for any solution that didn't require admitting defeat. The other Dark Lords sensed something wrong. Some argued against using such a weapon, but Kashan's madness had infected the Brotherhood like a plague. And in the end, fear of death overwhelmed wisdom. They gathered in a cave system beneath Ruusan's surface, hundreds of Sith Lords and Dark Jedi, pooling their power into the ritual that would create the Thought Bomb. The air itself screamed as they worked, reality bending under the weight of so much concentrated dark side energy. Bane watched from a distance, his obelisk armor pulsing with the reflected power. Above ground, the Jedi's Army of Light charged forward, sensing an opportunity to end the Brotherhood once and for all. Lord Hoth led them personally, his battle meditation coordinating hundreds of Jedi into a single devastating assault. They arrived at the caves just as the ritual completed. The Thought Bomb detonated in silence more terrible than any explosion. No sound, no light, just an absence that spread outward at the speed of thought. Where it touched, Force users simply ceased to exist. Their bodies remained empty shells collapsing where they stood. But their essence, their consciousness, their connection to the Force was ripped away and trapped in a sphere of pure agony that would persist for 1,000 years. In seconds, it was over. Every Sith Lord in the Brotherhood of Darkness, gone. Every Jedi in the Army of Light, gone. 1,000 years of war ended in a moment of absolute destruction. Bane stood alone among the corpses. The obelisk armor had saved him, just barely. The pain of the parasites feeding on the thought bomb's residual energy was indescribable, but he lived, the only Sith Lord remaining in the entire galaxy. And there, among the ruins of both orders, he found her. A child, no more than 10 years old, huddled in a cave, surrounded by the bodies of dead Jedi who had tried to protect her. Her eyes were too old for her face. The war had stolen her childhood and left only trauma and rage. But when she looked at Bane, he saw something else: potential, power, the perfect student to begin the rule of two. Her name was Rain, but he would give her a new name, a Sith name, Darth Zana. Together, they walked away from Rusan, away from the thought bomb's lingering presence, away from the greatest battle of the new Sith Wars. Behind them, the Republic celebrated, the Jedi mourned their fallen, but declared victory. The Sith were extinct. The war was over. Peace would reign for 1,000 years. They were wrong. The Sith weren't extinct. They had simply learned patience. The girl's name had been Rain, but that child died on Rusan along with everything else. Bane found her in the aftermath, a small figure standing among corpses that would haunt lesser minds forever. Her family had been killed early in the war. The Jedi had taken her in, recognizing Force sensitivity, but never quite trusting what they saw in her eyes. She was too angry, too willing to hurt those who threatened her, too comfortable with violence for one so young. The thought bomb's detonation had killed her Jedi protectors instantly. She watched them collapse, felt their presence vanish from the Force like candles snuffed by an invisible wind. And in that moment, something inside her broke free from the chains the Jedi had tried to impose. When Bane approached, she didn't run, didn't cry, simply looked at him, with eyes that understood exactly what he was, what he offered. "They're all dead," she said, her voice steady, despite her age. "The Jedi, the Sith, everyone." "Not everyone," Bane replied, studying this child who radiated such potential. "The weak are dead. The failed philosophies lie buried in those caves. But the Sith endure. We always endure." He knelt before her, bringing his armored face level with hers. The obelisks shifted across his skin, causing pain that had become as familiar as breathing. "I can teach you what they wouldn't, show you how to use your anger instead of suppressing it, make you stronger than any Jedi who ever drew breath." He extended a hand, "But you must leave behind who you were, become something new, something powerful." She took his hand without hesitation. "Your name was Rain," Bane said, "but rain falls and evaporates, and is forgotten. You will be Zana, Darth Zana, and you will help me reshape the galaxy." They left Rusan aboard a transport Bane had hidden in the jungle. Behind them, Republic forces arrived to find a battlefield littered with the bodies of both armies. The Chancellor declared a day of mourning and celebration combined. So many Jedi lost, but the Sith were finally extinct. The 1,000-year war was over. The galaxy exhaled. Began the slow process of healing. Planets devastated by the conflict started rebuilding. Trade routes reopened. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions, spread through the Republic like dawn after endless night. And in the shadows, unnoticed and patient, Bane began teaching his apprentice the ways of the Sith. Their first sanctuary was Ambria, a world touched by ancient darkness but largely ignored by both Republic and Jedi. Here, in caves that had once housed a powerful Sith sorceress, Bane taught Zana the fundamentals, not the Brotherhood's weakened philosophy, but the pure teachings he had gleaned from Revan's holocron and his own hard experience. "The Sith Code is not metaphor," he told her during their first formal lesson. "Peace is a lie, not because we wish it so, but because the universe itself is conflict. Stars war with gravity. Species compete for resources. even your own cells battle against entropy every moment of your existence. Xana absorbed everything with a hunger that matched his own. Her aptitude for Sith sorcery revealed itself quickly. While Bane's power manifested as raw physical force, overwhelming and direct, Xana's strength lay in manipulation, illusions that could shatter minds, compulsions that turned enemies into puppets, mental invasions that left victims questioning their own sanity. She was patient where he was aggressive, subtle where he was obvious, the perfect complement to his strengths, and a harbinger of what would eventually make her dangerous even to him. The training was brutal, because anything less would fail to prepare her for what the rule of two demanded. One day, she would have to kill him, surpass him, prove herself the stronger. And if she couldn't, then his entire philosophy was worthless. But that confrontation lay decades in the future, for now she was the student and he the master. And together they began the work of surviving in a galaxy that believed the Sith extinct. Survival required resources, credits to purchase equipment, information, passage on ships that asked no questions. Bane had learned much from the Brotherhood's mistakes. They had announced themselves, built armies, declared war openly. Every one of these actions had ultimately led to their destruction. The rule of two would operate differently, in shadows, through intermediaries, building wealth and influence while remaining invisible to those who might oppose them. Bane's obelisk armor made him instantly recognizable, so Xana became their public face. A young woman seeking opportunities, hiring herself out as bodyguard or enforcer to criminal enterprises. She gathered credits and information while her master remained hidden, studying the ancient texts they acquired from forgotten Sith tombs and abandoned libraries. Years passed in this fashion. The Republic's historical records listed the Sith as extinct, casualties of their own superweapon on Ruusan. The Jedi Order rebuilt slowly, traumatized by the loss of so many masters and knights. They taught their new students about the Sith in past tense. Lessons from history, dangers that had been overcome. None suspected that in the darkness between stars, two figures plotted with a patience that transcended individual lifetimes. The rule of two wasn't about immediate victory. It was about survival, evolution, building power so slowly, so carefully, that when the Sith finally struck, the galaxy would never see it coming. Bane watched his apprentice grow from traumatized child into capable young woman. Watched her master techniques that had taken him years to learn, saw in her the validation of everything Revan's holocron had taught him. The Sith would survive, not through armies or declarations of war, but through two individuals so powerful, so perfectly trained, that they could manipulate galactic events from the shadows. And when one fell, another would rise, stronger, better, refined by the crucible of succession. It was a plan that would take 1,000 years to bear fruit. But Bane had learned patience from the obelisks that fed on his flesh, had learned to endure agony in pursuit of greater goals, had learned that some victories required sacrifices that lesser beings couldn't comprehend. The galaxy celebrated peace. The Sith prepared for war. And between these two realities, the future took shape in ways no one could predict. Xana's training continued. The rule of two had begun, and though no one knew it yet, the fate of the galaxy had already been decided in a cave on Ruusan, where all the old Sith died, so that something far more dangerous could be born. 10 years after Ruusan, the galaxy had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The Republic flourished in an era of prosperity that historians would later call the Golden Age. Without the constant drain of war, economies expanded. New colonies spread across previously contested territories. The Senate, freed from emergency military powers, returned to the gridlock and corruption that had always defined it. The Jedi Order rebuilt its temple on Coruscant, trained new Padawans, and tried to forget the scars that Ruusan had carved into their collective soul. They succeeded better than they should have. Within a decade, most Jedi spoke of the Sith as ancient history, a threat overcome, a darkness banished. They were catastrophically wrong. Bane and Zana had spent those 10 years becoming something the galaxy had never seen. Not Sith Lords in the traditional sense, announcing their presence and gathering followers. Instead, they were phantoms, whispers, suspicions that dissolved under scrutiny. Their wealth had grown through careful manipulation of markets and criminal enterprises. Zana had proven particularly adept at this work. She could walk into a room of hardened criminals and emerge having convinced them that her suggestions were their own brilliant ideas. Months later, when their operations inevitably failed or turned against them, none suspected the beautiful young woman who had offered such helpful advice. Bane remained hidden, his obelisk armor making public appearances impossible. The parasites had fused completely with his flesh over the years, their shells forming an impenetrable second skin that covered everything except his face, hands, and feet. They fed constantly on his connection to the dark side, granting him strength and resilience that bordered on supernatural. But there was a cost. There was always a cost. The pain had become his constant companion. Every movement sent agony rippling through his nervous system. The obelisks released chemicals into his bloodstream that kept him perpetually on edge, aggressive, ready for violence. Sleep came in brief, troubled intervals. Peace was impossible. Yet this torture had an unexpected benefit. The constant suffering kept him connected to the dark side with an intensity that required no meditation or focus. His power had grown beyond anything he'd achieved at the academy. He could crush stone with a thought, call lightning from clear skies, bend weaker minds like soft metal. Zana had developed differently. Where Bane was a hammer, she had become a scalpel. Her mastery of Sith sorcery had progressed to levels that impressed even her master. She could craft illusions so perfect that victims never realized they weren't experiencing reality, could invade minds and rewrite memories, could kill with curses that left no physical trace. They were the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, and no one knew they existed. Their studies had taken them to forgotten corners of known space. Korriban's tombs yielded holocrons that the Brotherhood had never found. On Ziost, they discovered libraries sealed since the Great Hyperspace War. Each world added to their knowledge, building an archive of Sith wisdom that hadn't been assembled in millennia. But knowledge without practical application was worthless. They needed to test themselves, to ensure the rule of two was creating Sith stronger than those who came before. The test came from an unexpected direction. Princess Sarah of Dowan was nobility of a minor world, beautiful and intelligent, and consumed by a hatred that had defined her adult life. Her father had died on Ruusan, a Sith Lord in the Brotherhood of Darkness. He had perished when the thought bomb detonated. Sarah had been a child, then sheltered and innocent. The years had hardened her. She blamed the Sith for her father's death, but specifically blamed Bane. Rumors whispered that he had been on Ruusan, that he had somehow survived when all others fell, that he bore responsibility for the catastrophe. These rumors were carefully planted by Bane himself. The first principle of the rule of two was invisibility, but the second was equally important. When enemies came, they must be destroyed so completely that even their suspicions died with them. Sarah hired assassins, the best that credits could buy. 5 warriors whose skills had been honed in the underworld wars that the Republic pretended didn't exist. Each carried weapons designed to kill Force users, cortosis shields that could block lightsabers, sonic weapons that disrupted concentration, toxins that affected midi-chlorians. They tracked Bane to Dowan itself, to an estate he had purchased under false identity. The irony amused him. Sarah had unknowingly invited her target into her own territory. The attack came at night, coordinated with military precision. They breached the estate's defenses simultaneously from 3 directions, moving with the confidence of professionals who had never failed a contract. They were dead within minutes. Bane met them in the courtyard, his lightsaber blazing purple in the darkness. The obelisks made him nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Blaster bolts splashed harmlessly against his armored chest. Vibroblades skittered across his shell without penetrating. Even their cortosis weapons proved ineffective against an opponent who didn't rely solely on his lightsaber. He used the Force like a bludgeon, lifted 2 assassins and slammed them together with such force that their bones shattered audibly. Cold lightning that cooked another inside his armor. The remaining 2 tried to flee. One made it 3 steps before Bane's thrown lightsaber took his head. The last died begging for mercy that would never come. But in those final moments, one assassin landed a lucky strike. His vibro blade found the gap between obelisk shells at Bane's shoulder joint. The weapon pierced deep, and something went catastrophically wrong. The obelisks, disturbed by the injury, went berserk. They began feeding on Bane, with the same hunger they normally reserve for dark side energy. Their shells contracted, crushing his flesh. Their chemicals flooded his system in quantities meant to kill. He collapsed, convulsing, feeling the parasites that had protected him for a decade suddenly become his executioners. Zana arrived to find her master dying in a courtyard surrounded by corpses. For a moment she hesitated. The rule of 2 demanded that apprentices eventually kill their masters. This was an opportunity. She could let the obelisks finish their work and emerge as the new Dark Lord. But she wasn't ready, not yet. She still had techniques to learn, knowledge to acquire, and deep within her, beneath layers of Sith teaching and dark side philosophy, a small part of the girl called Rain still existed. That part wasn't ready to watch the only person who had ever truly understood her die. She needed a healer, someone skilled enough to remove obelisks that had fused with living flesh, someone powerful enough in the Force to keep Bane alive during a procedure that should kill him. She found Caleb. The old man had left Korriban years ago, seeking redemption for his time serving the Sith Academy. He had become healer to the royal house of Daun, using his knowledge of the Force to cure ailments that conventional medicine couldn't touch. He was good, skilled, powerful enough for what Zana needed. He was also the same healer who had helped Bane recover after Sirac's beating, though neither recognized the other at first. Years and trauma had changed them both beyond recognition. When Zana brought her dying master to Caleb's chambers, when she revealed what he truly was and demanded help on pain of death, the old healer faced an impossible choice. Help a Sith Lord and betray everything the Jedi stood for, refuse and die, along with his patient. He chose survival, chose to use his gifts to save a life, even if that life belonged to someone who would use it to spread darkness. The procedure took hours. Using the Force, Caleb carefully separated each obelisk from Bane's flesh. It was like peeling living armor from muscle and bone, each parasite fighting removal with desperate hunger. Bane's screams echoed through the palace. Servants fled. Guards investigated but were turned away by Zana's mind tricks. When it was finished, Bane lay unconscious, his body a mass of raw wounds where the obelisks had been. But he lived, and slowly powered by the dark side, and Caleb's reluctant healing he began to recover. Princess Sarah never learned how close she came to achieving her revenge, never discovered that the man she sought had been in her own palace, saved by her own healer. The assassin's failure was attributed to overconfidence. The matter was closed. But Bane had learned something crucial during those hours of agony. His body was vulnerable in ways he hadn't considered. The obelisks had made him powerful but dependent. Without them he was strong but mortal, subject to age and injury like any other being. For the first time since Rusign, Darth Bane confronted his own mortality and began searching for ways to transcend it. The stone prison had earned its name from architecture that predated the Republic itself. Massive blocks of granite, each weighing tons, fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed. It sat on a plateau overlooking Dojan's capital, a monument to an age when rulers built to intimidate rather than inspire. Princess Sarah had converted it into a private sanctuary, a place to plan, to brood, to nurture the hatred that had sustained her since childhood. The assassins had failed, but failure was simply information. Next time, she would hire better killers, bring more resources to bear. Eventually, Bane would die, and her father would be avenged. She didn't know he was already there. Bane had recovered from the obelisk removal, though the process had taken weeks and left him weaker than he'd been in years. His body, freed from the parasite's chemicals, felt strange, lighter, less painful, but also less connected to the constant rage that had fueled him. He could have killed Sarah easily, walked into her chambers, and ended the threat she represented with a thought, but that would have been wasteful. She was nobility, connected to Republic politics in ways that could prove useful. Better to leave her alive and manipulated than dead and martyred. The plan was simple: confront her directly. Use the Force to rewrite her memories of her father's death. Make her believe the Jedi were responsible. Turn her hatred toward more useful targets. It would take minutes, and afterward she would be an unwitting asset rather than an enemy. Bane entered the stone prison at sunset, when shadows grew long and guards grew complacent. Zana remained outside, monitoring approaches, ready to intervene if complications arose. They did, though not from the direction either expected. Sarah had hired more assassins, not 5 this time, but a dozen. And she had learned from previous failures. These warriors carried weapons specifically designed to counter Force users, Ysalamirian nutrient frames, creatures whose biology created bubbles where the Force simply didn't exist. Sonic weapons calibrated to frequencies that disrupted concentration. Nets woven with cortosis that could tangle a lightsaber. They struck as Bane climbed the main staircase, attacking from multiple levels simultaneously. The Ysalamiri's Force nullification bubbles overlapped, creating a dead zone that severed his connection to the power he relied upon. For the second time in his life, Bane fought without the Force, but unlike the scared student who had been beaten by Serac, he was now a master of lightsaber combat. His blade wove patterns of light and death, each movement economical and devastating. 2 assassins fell in the first exchange, their bodies tumbling down stone steps. A third lost his weapon arm to a stroke so fast it seemed to teleport. But there were too many, and they were too skilled. A sonic weapon caught him square in the chest, the blast rupturing organs and sending him crashing into the wall. A cortosis net wrapped around his legs. Blaster fire from 3 directions stitched burns across his torso. He should have died there. Would have died if Zana hadn't felt the disturbance through their Force bond. She came through the stone prison like a nightmare given form. Her lightsaber humming death songs, her sorcery twisting reality around her. The assassins turned to face this new threat and discovered their fatal mistake. While Bane was power and aggression, Zana was subtlety and precision. She crafted an illusion that made each assassin see their companions as Sith Lords. They turned on each other in confused panic, killing with the efficiency they'd planned to use on their actual targets. When the slaughter ended, when the last assassin lay dead from his companion's blade, Zana found Bane crumpled against the wall. His breathing was labored. Blood soaked his robes. The sonic weapon had done internal damage that wouldn't heal naturally. "I need Caleb," he managed. Each word an effort. The healer. He's in the palace. Xana's mind raced through possibilities. Caleb had helped them once, but bringing him here would expose their presence, create complications. witnesses, yet watching her master die was equally unacceptable. She made her decision and went to collect the healer. Caleb's chambers in the royal palace were peaceful, filled with medical equipment both technological and force-based. He was preparing for sleep when Xana appeared in his doorway like a ghost. "You saved him once," she said, without preamble. "You'll save him again." The old healer studied her, recognition dawning slowly. The girl from before, the Sith apprentice. He shook his head. "I helped you because I had no choice. Don't expect cooperation now." Xana's hand moved in a subtle gesture. Caleb felt his thoughts reorganize, his resistance crumbling under compulsion so skillful he barely noticed it happening. "You'll come because healing is what you are," Xana said softly. "Because letting someone die when you have the power to save them would destroy everything you believe about yourself. The fact that he's Sith is irrelevant to who you are." It was manipulation worthy of her master. Caleb followed, because she made him want to follow, made him believe it was his own choice. At the stone prison, surrounded by corpses of assassins who had killed each other in madness, Caleb worked his healing arts on the fallen Sith Lord. He mended ruptured organs, sealed internal bleeding, used the Force to accelerate cellular repair beyond anything Bacta could achieve. As he worked, he spoke, perhaps trying to convince himself his actions were justified. "Your armor," Caleb said, his hands glowing with healing energy. "The parasites, I felt them when I removed them. They were killing you slowly." "Everything worth having comes with a price," Bane replied through gritted teeth. "Power, knowledge, immortality, all require sacrifice." "Immortality," Caleb paused in his work. "There's no such thing. The Force flows through all living things, and all living things die. The Jedi believe that because they lack imagination." Bane's voice was stronger now, the healing taking effect. "But there are techniques, ancient knowledge, ways to preserve consciousness beyond physical death." Caleb said nothing, but something in his expression suggested he had heard such claims before, dismissed them as impossible or unwise. When the healing was complete, when Bane could stand under his own power, Xana faced a choice. Caleb had saved them twice. Now, he knew they existed, knew they were Sith operating in secret. By all logic of the rule of two, he should die. But Bane stopped her before she could ignite her lightsaber. "Let him live," the Dark Lord said. "He has proven useful twice, may prove so again, and his death would raise questions we don't need." It was a calculated risk, but Caleb was old, isolated, unconnected to the Jedi Order. His testimony, if he ever gave it, would be dismissed as the ravings of a confused healer who had spent too long serving the Sith Academy. They left him there among the bodies, mind intact but memories carefully edited by Xana's sorcery. He would remember healing someone, would remember violence, but the details would blur and fade like dreams upon waking. Princess Sarah returned to find her assassins dead and her healer traumatized. She blamed Bane, though she had no proof. Her hatred intensified, but now it was coupled with fear. Whatever this Sith Lord was, he seemed unkillable. She never learned how close she had come to victory, never knew that her own healer had saved her enemy's life in her own fortress. Bane and Xana departed Doden that night, leaving behind confusion and corpses. The Dark Lord walked without the obelisk armor for the first time in a decade. His body felt fragile, mortal, vulnerable to age and injury in ways that terrified him more than any enemy. The solution, he decided, lay in the ancient knowledge he'd dismissed before: essence transfer. The technique that Darth had pioneered, a way to move one's consciousness into a new body, to transcend physical death entirely. Finding that knowledge would require locating Anders holocron, and that would lead them to Prakith, to ancient tombs, and to discoveries that would define the final test between master and apprentice. But that confrontation still lay years in the future. For now they had survived another trial, proven the rule of two effective, even against overwhelming odds. The Sith endured, patient, hidden, growing stronger, while the galaxy remained blind to the darkness gathering in its shadows. The years following Dawn changed something fundamental in Bane's relationship with power. For the first time since embracing the dark side, he understood that strength alone wasn't enough. Bodies failed, flesh weakened. Even the most powerful Force user eventually succumbed to age and entropy. This was unacceptable. The ancient Sith had understood this problem. Many had sought solutions. Most failed, their ambitions crumbling with their mortal forms. But a few, the truly brilliant or truly mad, had discovered techniques that transcended the limitations of biology. Darth Undead was chief among them. 5,000 years before Bane's birth, Undeader had ruled a small kingdom through terror and dark side mastery. But ruling held no interest for him beyond providing resources for his true obsession. He feared death with an intensity that consumed every other consideration. His entire existence became a quest for immortality. And he succeeded. The technique was called essence transfer, a way to move consciousness from a dying body into a living vessel. The ultimate form of possession, requiring the target's will to be completely broken before the transfer could succeed. Undeader had perfected this art, supposedly living for centuries by stealing the bodies of his own followers. His eventual death came not from age, but from betrayal. His own apprentices, terrified of being his next vessel, had conspired to destroy him. They succeeded in killing his current body, but couldn't destroy his legacy, and Dayu's holocron remained hidden, containing the knowledge that Bane now desperately sought. The search took 2 years. Ancient texts provided clues. Prakith, a world deep in the deep core, far from Republic surveillance or Jedi patrols, a fortress tomb built to withstand millennia, traps both technological and Force-based that had killed treasure hunters for thousands of years. Bane and Zana arrived during Prakith's brief summer, when the ice storms that dominated most of the year subsided enough to allow surface expeditions. The fortress rose from frozen wasteland like a broken tooth, its architecture designed to intimidate rather than inspire. The outer defenses were crude by modern standards. Automated turrets that had long since depleted their power cells, blast doors rusted open by millennia of neglect. But these were meant only to deter casual scavengers. The real dangers lay deeper. They descended into darkness that had remained undisturbed since the old Republic's infancy. The air itself felt wrong, thick with residual dark side energy that made breathing difficult. Ancient Sith runes covered the walls, warnings in dead languages that promised terrible fates to grave robbers. The first trap triggered when Bane's weight crossed a pressure plate invisible beneath centuries of dust. The corridor's floor dropped away, revealing a pit that descended into absolute darkness. He caught himself with the Force, hovering while stone blocks crashed into unseen depths below. Zana studied the mechanism with professional interest. Crude, but effective. Anyone not Force-sensitive would die instantly. Undeader didn't build this to kill Force users, Bane replied, pulling himself back to solid ground. These are screens, filters to eliminate the unworthy before they reach the real defenses. He was proven correct 3 chambers later. The Guardian was ancient beyond measure, a Sith war droid from an era when such machines were animated by trapped spirits of fallen Darksiders. It stood 3 meters tall, its chassis covered in runes that pulsed with malevolent life. When it moved, the sound was bone scraping against metal, utterly wrong on a fundamental level. It attacked with speed that contradicted its obvious age. Energy weapons that shouldn't have had power after 5 millennia fired with deadly accuracy. Cortosis blades extended from its arms, whirring to life with sounds that set teeth on edge. Bane met it head-on, his lightsaber clashing against Cortosis in showers of sparks. Zana circled, looking for weaknesses, her mind already crafting illusions designed to confuse its ancient targeting systems. The battle was brief and savage. The droid was powerful but predictable, its programming unable to adapt to opponents, using techniques developed centuries after its creation. Bane's raw strength overwhelmed its defenses, while Zana's sorcery convinced its senses that threats existed where there were none. When it finally collapsed, systems failing after a fight they were never designed to survive, the way forward opened. The holocron chamber was surprisingly simple. No additional traps, no further guardians, just a pedestal in the center of a spherical room, and upon it a pyramid of deep crimson crystal that pulsed with contained awareness. Bane reached for it, and Darth and Edge Gatekeeper manifested. The holographic figure bore little resemblance to the historical accounts, where those described a powerful Sith Lord radiating command. This projection seemed diminished, paranoid, eyes that darted constantly, searching for threats that existed only in memory. "You seek the secret of eternal life," the Gatekeeper said, its voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "You wish to escape death, as I did, to transcend the weakness of flesh." "I seek knowledge that should belong to the Sith," Bane replied carefully. "Techniques that ensure our survival across generations." The Gatekeeper's laugh was unpleasant, high-pitched and manic. "Survival across generations? No. You want personal immortality. Don't pretend otherwise. I can see your fear. Smell it like rot on a corpse. You're terrified of dying, now that your armor is gone." It was uncomfortably accurate. Bane said nothing, waiting. "The technique exists." And Dedo's echo continued. "I perfected it, lived for centuries wearing different skins like a tailor wears different robes. But why would I teach you? What incentive do I have to help you achieve what I spent lifetimes perfecting?" This was the problem with holocrons created by paranoid madmen. Their gatekeepers inherited those same traits, making them unreliable even to their intended students. Zana stepped forward, her voice smooth and reasonable. "Because knowledge locked away is worthless. Because teaching ensures your legacy continues even though your body failed. Because refusing serves no purpose except spite." The Gatekeeper considered this, its projected face twisting through expressions too quick to follow. Finally, it spoke with resignation that bordered on bitterness. "I will teach. But slowly, carefully, prove yourselves worthy of each lesson before the next is revealed. And know this, the technique requires a vessel, a living body to inhabit, and the process destroys that person's consciousness completely. Eternal life. Yes, but built on murdered souls." Bane felt no moral qualms about this revelation. Murder was simply a tool, neither good nor evil in itself. What mattered was the goal it served. They took the holocron and departed Prakith, leaving the ancient fortress to its eternal vigil. The journey back to their hidden sanctuary was quiet. Both master and apprentice understood what possession of this knowledge meant. Eventually, Bane would attempt the transfer, and when he did, he would need a vessel, a body young and strong, and force sensitive enough to contain his power. He had an apprentice who met every one of those criteria. Zana, for her part, also understood the implications perfectly. She had known from the beginning that the rule of two demanded she eventually kill her master, but she had assumed it would be through lightsaber combat or Sith sorcery, an honest test of strength. Now she faced a different possibility, that Bane would attempt to steal her body, to continue his existence by destroying hers. The trust between them, already strained by the nature of their relationship, began to fracture. And in those fractures the final confrontation took root. 20 years had passed since Rusin. The girl who had been Rain, who had become Zana, had transformed into something that would have terrified the Jedi who once tried to train her. She was 30 years old, at the peak of her physical and force abilities, and her mastery of Sith sorcery had progressed beyond anything her master had achieved. Bane was 50. His body, freed from the obelisks but scarred by their decade-long presence, showed signs of deterioration that no amount of dark side energy could completely arrest. He was still powerful, perhaps more so than during his armored years, but the trajectory was undeniable, downward, toward weakness and eventually death. The holocron of Darth remained their most precious possession and their greatest source of conflict. The gatekeeper taught with agonizing slowness, revealing fragments of the essence transfer technique in lessons that took months to complete. Both Sith studied obsessively, but for different reasons. Bane sought the knowledge to achieve immortality. Zana sought it to understand how to defend against it. Their relationship had evolved into something complex and dangerous. Publicly, when dealing with the criminal enterprises that funded their activities, they maintained perfect master and apprentice roles. Privately, they circled each other like predators, each waiting for the other to reveal weakness. The rule of two demanded this, required it. The apprentice must eventually surpass the master, or the entire philosophy failed. But knowing this intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were entirely different things. Bane had spent 2 decades training Zana, had taught her everything he knew without reservation, understanding that holding back knowledge would only weaken the Sith lineage. He had watched her grow from traumatized child into one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, and despite every Sith teaching about rejecting attachment, he had developed something uncomfortably close to pride in her accomplishments, which made what he was contemplating feel like betrayal. The essence transfer would destroy her, erase everything she had become to preserve what he was. It violated the spirit of the rule of two, while technically adhering to its letter: one master, one apprentice. Just the same master in a different body. Zana sensed his internal conflict and felt something equally uncomfortable. Not quite affection, because Sith didn't feel such weakness, but perhaps recognition of shared experience. Bane was the only person who had ever truly understood her, who had seen the darkness inside and nurtured it rather than trying to suppress it. Killing him would be difficult in ways that had nothing to do with his power. Their studies took them to worlds long forgotten by the Republic. On Korriban, they explored tombs that even the Brotherhood of Darkness had missed. On Ziost, they discovered libraries sealed since the Great Hyperspace War. Each expedition added to their knowledge and deepened the unspoken tension. Bane's research increasingly focused on preparation for the transfer. He studied not just the technique itself, but optimal conditions for success. The vessel needed to be force-sensitive, yes, but also mentally vulnerable, broken in will, open to possession through either exhaustion or defeat. The most effective method was combat, a lightsaber duel pushed to absolute limits, where the opponent's defenses collapsed from sheer fatigue. At that moment of ultimate weakness, consciousness could slip between bodies like water flowing from one vessel to another. Zana's research took a different path. She delved into Sith sorcery that could shield the mind from invasion. Techniques for maintaining mental barriers even under extreme duress, and quietly, subtly, she began searching for potential apprentices of her own. Not to betray Bane prematurely, but to have options if his attempt to possess her failed. The rule of two would continue regardless of which of them survived. The breakthrough came during a journey to Tython, birthplace of the Jedi Order, but also home to dark side vergences that predated any formal Force tradition. In ruins older than recorded history, Bane found texts describing consciousness preservation in its purest form. The technique was more complex than he'd imagined, more dangerous. The transfer wasn't guaranteed to succeed even under optimal conditions, and failure meant oblivion, not death, which was at least natural, but complete erasure of consciousness, an ending so absolute that even the Force wouldn't remember him. The risk should have given him pause, should have made him reconsider, but fear of normal death had grown into an obsession that overrode rational thought. He had achieved too much to simply fade into history like every other mortal being. Zana watched her master's obsession grow with clinical detachment. This was weakness. Understandable, perhaps even sympathetic, but weakness nonetheless. The dark side demanded strength, not desperate, clutching at impossible immortality. She began to understand that their confrontation was inevitable, not next year or even next month, but soon. The question wasn't whether they would fight, but when and under what circumstances. The danded holocron became a source of bitter amusement for both of them. Its gatekeeper would teach either master or apprentice, showing no preference, understanding that eventually one would use this knowledge to destroy the other. The ancient Sith Lord's paranoia had infected even his teaching methods. During meditation, when Bane allowed his guard to drop slightly, Zana could sense his thoughts. He was planning, calculating, searching for the perfect moment to make his attempt. He hadn't yet decided definitively to target her body, but the possibility grew more concrete with each passing day. She prepared her own contingencies, identified Force-sensitive individuals who could serve as apprentices if needed, studied techniques for severing Force bonds quickly and completely, practiced mental defenses until they became as natural as breathing. The galaxy continued its peaceful existence, unaware that in the shadows two beings plotted scenarios that would determine the Sith's future. The Republic grew complacent. The Jedi Order focused on philosophical debates rather than watching for darkness. Nobody suspected that the ancient enemy still existed, let alone that it was preparing for internal succession through potential murder. But events were accelerating beyond either Sith's control. Other forces were moving, old enemies were stirring, and the carefully constructed isolation that Bane and Zana had maintained for 2 decades was about to shatter. Set Hoth was coming. The Huntress was on their trail, and the Jedi were beginning to suspect that rumors of the Sith's extinction might have been premature. The endgame was beginning. Master and apprentice both felt it through the Force. A convergence approaching, a confrontation that would prove the rule of two either valid or fatally flawed. They continued their studies, continued their training, continued preparing for a battle that both knew was inevitable, but neither wanted to initiate. Patience had always been the Sith's greatest weapon. Now it would be tested to its absolute limits. Bane's body was failing. 20 years without the obelisks had seemed like liberation initially. Freedom from constant agony, return to normal sensation. But the parasites had done more than protect him. Their chemicals had preserved his flesh, kept cellular degradation at bay, maintained his physical form at peak performance far longer than nature intended. Now at 50, he was paying the price for that decade of artificial preservation. His joints ached with an intensity that meditation couldn't fully suppress. His reflexes, once supernaturally quick, had slowed to merely exceptional. Techniques that had once flowed effortlessly now required concentration and effort. He was still one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, but the trajectory was unmistakable, downward, toward weakness, toward obsolescence, toward death. The dark side could sustain him, yes, channel his life force in ways that extended his years beyond normal limits, but even that had a ceiling. Already he could feel his body consuming itself. Every use of Force lightning left him weaker, Every extended meditation required longer recovery periods. The machine was breaking down from the inside. Essence transfer was no longer a precaution, it was survival. The Undead Holocron had finally revealed the complete technique. The ritual was brutal in its simplicity. No elaborate ceremonies or ancient artifacts required. Just combat pushed beyond normal limits. Two Force users dueling until one's defenses collapsed completely. At that moment of absolute vulnerability, consciousness could migrate from dying flesh to living vessel. The Gatekeeper had been characteristically blunt about success rates. 50% under optimal conditions. Those odds improved if the target was exhausted or wounded, decreased dramatically if they maintained mental shields or possessed strong will. Bane needed advantages, every one he could manufacture. He began searching for alternative apprentices, not to replace Xana permanently, but to serve as backup vessel if she proved too difficult to possess. The search led him to set Hoth, and that introduction set in motion events that would cascade beyond anyone's control. Hoth was everything an apprentice should be on paper. Force-sensitive at levels that approached Xana's potential, intelligent, ambitious, ruthless. He had carved out his own small criminal empire on the Outer Rim through manipulation and selective violence. His instincts for survival were almost supernatural. But those same survival instincts were also his fatal flaw. Bane approached him with an offer: training in return for service, access to ancient Sith knowledge in exchange for loyalty. The rule of two required just one apprentice, but having a backup option while Bane's body deteriorated seemed prudent. Hoth accepted with enthusiasm. That should have been suspicious. He was too eager, too willing to abandon everything he'd built for promises of dark side power. And when Bane began teaching him, when the ancient knowledge was shared, Hoth's true nature revealed itself. He was a coward. Not in combat, where his skills proved formidable. Not in facing external threats, which he handled with cold efficiency, but in facing himself, in accepting the sacrifices that true power demanded. In embracing the darkness completely rather than using it as a tool while remaining emotionally distant. During a training session on Ambria, Bane revealed his intentions more directly than he'd planned. Perhaps the deterioration was affecting his judgment. Perhaps he simply wanted to see how Hoth would react to pressure. The rule of two demands succession, Bane said, watching his potential apprentice practice lightsaber forms. Eventually, you'll need to kill me. Prove yourself stronger. Take my place as master and find your own apprentice. Hoth's response was carefully neutral. Of course, that's the philosophy you've taught. But there's another way, Bane continued. An alternative to death. The essence transfer allows consciousness to survive in a new body, to continue teaching across multiple lifetimes. He saw understanding bloom in Hoth's eyes, followed immediately by terror as implications became clear. You want a vessel, Hoth said slowly, a body to possess. I haven't decided yet, Bane replied honestly. Xana is strong, well-trained, but alternatives are prudent. That night, Set Hoth disappeared, took a ship, and fled to the farthest corner of the galaxy he could reach. His ambition had limits after all. Death in honorable combat was one thing. Having his consciousness erased so his body could serve as someone else's container was entirely different. Bane let him go. The loss was disappointing, but not catastrophic. Hoth had revealed himself as unsuitable through his cowardice. Better to learn this now than during a crucial moment. But Hoth's flight had consequences beyond Bane's immediate plans. The rogue apprentice, desperate to cover his tracks, hired a professional hunter to eliminate anyone who might track him. That hunter, an Iktochi woman named Lucia, was given Bane's description and last known location. The Huntress, as she styled herself, was among the best trackers in the known galaxy. Her species' natural precognitive abilities made her nearly impossible to evade, and she had no force sensitivity to make her vulnerable to Sith manipulation. Just skill, determination, and weapons designed to kill targets far more dangerous than normal humans. Bane became aware of her pursuit through disturbances in the Force. Someone was tracking him with professional competence, closing distance slowly but inexorably. He could kill her when they met, certainly, but her presence raised questions. Who hired her? What did they know? How much exposure had Darth created through his panic? The rule of two's greatest strength was invisibility. If that was compromised, advantages accumulated over 2 decades would evaporate. Worse complications were emerging from a different direction. The Jedi had begun noticing patterns, nothing obvious or conclusive, but troubling anomalies that suggested Force users operating outside their awareness. A Jedi investigator named Med had spent 5 years studying dark-side disturbances across the Outer Rim. Individually, each incident seemed like minor corruption, a crime lord displaying unusual tactical brilliance, a corporate executive making impossibly fortunate investment decisions, a planetary governor who crushed opposition with suspicious efficiency. But Med saw connections, patterns that suggested intelligence behind the chaos. He couldn't prove the Sith survived Ruusan, but his reports to the Council raised concerns that had been dormant for 2 decades. 2 more Jedi joined his investigation. Raskta, a Zabrak weapons master whose combat skills rivaled any living Jedi, and Saro Jedar, Syrian, whose analytical mind could unravel conspiracies that others missed completely. They began following the same trails that the Huntress tracked. Different motivations, same destination, converging on Bane's location through parallel investigation. The carefully constructed invisibility that had protected the Sith for 20 years was developing cracks. Not catastrophic yet, but growing. And Bane's deteriorating condition meant he couldn't simply flee and rebuild elsewhere. He needed the essence transfer soon, within months, not years. Which meant Zana. His apprentice had grown into everything he'd hoped. Powerful, intelligent, ruthless when necessary. She was ready to become master herself, ready to find her own apprentice and continue the lineage. Under normal circumstances, Bane would accept this with satisfaction, would face her in combat and either emerge victorious or die, knowing the Sith would survive his defeat. But these weren't normal circumstances. He had discovered knowledge that transcended the rule of two's traditional succession, a way to preserve decades of hard-won wisdom rather than forcing each generation to relearn everything. It was rationalization, and some part of him knew it. The truth was simpler and more shameful. He was afraid to die, afraid that everything he'd accomplished would end with his last breath, afraid of the oblivion that awaited beyond life. Fear was the path to the dark side. Yes, but it was also weakness that any true Sith should have transcended. Zana sensed his internal struggle through their Force bond, felt his fear and desperation like smoke on the wind. She began her own preparations, knowing the confrontation was approaching faster than either had anticipated. Separately, unknowingly, both master and apprentice made the same decision. Ambria would be the location, the world where they'd first begun training together, where the Sith had hidden for 2 decades, where ancient dark side nexuses would provide power to whoever proved stronger. The Hunters were coming, the Jedi were closing in, and the 2 most dangerous Force users in the galaxy were preparing to determine which would survive. The rule of 2 would be tested as never before, and the galaxy's future hung on the outcome of a duel that nobody except the participants would ever know occurred. The Force moved in patterns too complex for most beings to perceive, but those who lived in its currents, who breathed its essence with every moment, could sense when those patterns converged toward moments of significance. Destiny wasn't predetermined, but certain events carried weight that bent probability around them like gravity warping space. Ambria was becoming such a focal point. The Jedi arrived first, though they didn't realize their destination yet. Meded, Raskar, and Sarozaj had followed trails of dark side disturbances that stretched across a dozen systems, each incident minor by itself. A merchant whose intuition seemed supernatural, a crime lord who anticipated Republic enforcement actions before they happened. Small things that most would dismiss as luck or skill. But Med had studied the Sith for decades, had pored over historical accounts of how they operated when trying to remain hidden. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Force users operating covertly, building influence through proxies, manipulating events while remaining invisible. His theory was simple and terrifying. The Sith hadn't died on Ruusan. Somehow, at least one had survived, and for 20 years they had been rebuilding in shadows. The Council had been skeptical. The thought bomb's effects were well documented. Every Force-sensitive being within its radius had died. Hundreds of Jedi and Sith, gone in an instant. The idea that someone had survived seemed impossible. But Med was persistent, and his evidence, while circumstantial, formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss entirely. The Council authorized a small investigation. 3 Jedi, enough to verify or disprove the theory without committing significant resources. Raskar brought combat prowess that few could match. A Zabrak who had survived battles that killed entire strike teams. Her twin lightsabers moved with such fluid grace that opponents often didn't realize they were dead until they tried to move and discovered their bodies no longer responded. Sarozaj contributed analytical brilliance. His Syrian mind could process information at speeds that made human thought seem sluggish by comparison. He saw connections others missed, predicted behavior patterns from minimal data. If there were Sith hiding in the galaxy, his methods would expose them. Their investigation led to Ambria through elimination and deduction. The planet had strong dark side presence, was isolated from major trade routes, had historical connections to Sith activity during the Old Republic. It was exactly the kind of location someone trying to hide would choose. They didn't know that their quarry was already there. Didn't know they were walking into a confrontation that would prove fatal. The Huntress approached from a different angle. Lucia had tracked Bane through methods both mundane and Force-enhanced. Her Kitochi precognition allowed her to anticipate her target's movements with uncanny accuracy. Where he had been, where he was going. The pattern of his existence mapped across time like a constellation. Set Hoth's contract had been lucrative. Kill the Sith Lord, who knew too much. Ensure no one could track the rogue apprentice who fled rather than face his master's plans. She had accepted without understanding the full scope of what she hunted. In her experience, Force users were dangerous but still mortal, still killable with proper preparation and overwhelming force. She would learn otherwise on Ambria. Bane felt them coming, all of them. Through the Force, their intentions registered like ripples on still water. The Jedi seeking to verify impossible theories, the Hunter pursuing a contract, and beneath both, more dangerous than either, his apprentice preparing for their inevitable confrontation. The Anded holocron had finally yielded its last secrets, not through persuasion or brilliance, but through exhaustion. Even artificial intelligence imprinted on crystal eventually grew tired of withholding knowledge that no longer served any purpose. The gatekeeper had taught the complete essence transfer ritual with something approaching relief. The technique was brutal and elegant simultaneously. 2 Force users locked in combat, pushing beyond normal limits of endurance and power. When one's mental defenses finally collapsed, their consciousness became vulnerable. At that exact moment, the stronger will could migrate, pour itself into the defeated vessel like water filling an empty cup. The original consciousness would be obliterated, not killed, because that implied it went somewhere, simply erased, as if it had never existed. The body would remain functional, all memories intact but animated by a new awareness wearing the old identity like a costume. Success required the vessel to be completely broken, exhausted beyond recovery, will shattered by defeat. Any resistance at all would cause the transfer to fail, and failure meant oblivion for the consciousness attempting migration. Bane studied the technique with desperate intensity. His body was failing faster now. Some mornings he woke to find his hands shaking uncontrollably. His force sensitivity remained sharp, but the flesh that channeled it was becoming unreliable. He had months, perhaps a year, no more. Xana discovered his true intentions through careful observation rather than direct confrontation. Her master had grown careless, left holocron sessions running longer than he realized, spoke in his sleep about vessels and transfer and continuation. The pieces assembled into horrifying clarity. He was going to try to possess her, take her body, and erase her consciousness, continue his existence by murdering everything she had become. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected, not because she believed their relationship was built on trust or affection. A Sith didn't operate that way. But because it violated the rule of two's fundamental principle, the apprentice was supposed to surpass the master through superior power, to prove themselves worthy through legitimate victory. Stealing her body wasn't succession. It was cowardice disguised as wisdom. She began her own preparations with cold efficiency. If Bane wanted combat that pushed beyond normal limits, she would oblige. But the outcome would be his death, not her possession, and afterward she would need an apprentice of her own. The huntress would serve that purpose. Lucia possessed exactly the qualities Xana valued: patience, tactical brilliance, absolute focus on objectives regardless of obstacles. She would make an excellent Sith once properly trained. And the fact that she was currently hunting Bane added delicious irony to the choice. Both master and apprentice made arrangements, as if preparing for war, gathered resources, reviewed techniques, meditated on strategies that might provide advantages in the coming duel. They moved around each other with perfect courtesy, maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed, that their relationship remained teacher and student rather than predator and prey. Set Hoth remained hidden halfway across the galaxy, monitoring the situation through criminal contacts and paid informants. He wanted to know the outcome without being present for the confrontation, wanted to scavenge whatever remained after the stronger combatant emerged victorious. His cowardice would save his life, but doom him to footnote status in Sith history. The convergence accelerated. The Jedi's investigation traced dark side signatures directly to Umbria. Lucia's tracking narrowed to the same location, and on that isolated world, in the stone dwelling where they had lived for 2 decades, Bane and Xana prepared for their final test. The night before the confrontation, they shared a meal in silence. Both knew what was coming. Both understood that tomorrow would determine the Sith's future, whether the rule of two was valid philosophy or elaborate self-deception. Bane looked at his apprentice across the table and felt something he couldn't quite name: pride in what she had become, regret for what he was about to attempt, fear that he might fail, hope that he might succeed, all tangled together in a knot of emotion that no amount of Sith philosophy could unravel. Xana met his gaze with eyes that revealed nothing. She had learned that lesson well: never show weakness, never expose vulnerability. Keep your thoughts locked behind shields that even your master couldn't penetrate. They went to separate chambers, attempted sleep that wouldn't come, meditated on the Force, and felt it gathering around them like storm clouds before lightning. Dawn approached. With it, the end of an era. One way or another, The Darth Bane who had walked out of Rusin's ruins would cease to exist. What emerged would be something different. The Sith would continue, that much was certain, but in what form, animated by whose consciousness, remained to be determined. Outside, the first Jedi ships entered Ambria's atmosphere. The Huntress moved through the wilderness toward her target, and in the stone dwelling, 2 Sith Lords prepared to determine who would carry their legacy forward. The convergence was complete. Now came the resolution. The sun rose over Ambria's wilderness like it had for millions of years, indifferent to the violence about to unfold beneath its light. The stone dwelling where Bane and Zana had lived stood alone on the shore of Lake Nath, its walls remembering centuries of dark side practitioners who had sought power in this isolated place. Caleb's old home, the Jedi healer who had inadvertently saved Bane twice, was long dead, his bones resting beneath the very stones where his greatest mistake would reach its conclusion. Bane stood in the courtyard. As dawn light touched the lake's surface, his body ached with the familiar pain of deterioration, but his mind was focused with absolute clarity. Today he would transcend mortality or embrace oblivion. There was no middle path. Zana emerged from the dwelling, her lightsaber hanging at her side, her expression serene. She had spent the night in meditation, reinforcing mental shields that would resist possession. If her master wanted her body, he would have to kill her consciousness so completely that nothing remained to transfer into. They faced each other across 20 meters of stone courtyard, master and apprentice, creator and creation, 2 people who understood each other better than anyone else in the galaxy, preparing to destroy one another. "It doesn't have to be this way," Bane said, though both knew the words were meaningless. "You could take another apprentice, continue the lineage while I preserve the knowledge we've gathered. The rule of 2 demands succession through combat," Zana replied, her voice steady. "You taught me that weakness must be culled from the Sith. If you can't accept death, you've become too weak to lead." There was no anger in her words, no hatred or contempt, just statement of fact. The philosophy he had created was now being used to judge him and finding him wanting. Bane's lightsaber ignited, its violet blade humming with contained violence. Zana's followed, crimson light painting her features in shades of blood. They moved simultaneously. The duel that followed transcended normal combat. These were not students practicing forms or warriors fighting for their lives. These were artists expressing themselves through violence, each strike a statement of philosophy, each defense a rejection of the other's worldview. Bane fought with overwhelming power. His attacks came like hammer blows, designed to shatter defenses through sheer force. Lightning arced from his fingers between lightsaber strikes, turning the air itself into a weapon. The dark side flowed through him with intensity born of desperation. He wasn't just fighting to win, he was fighting to continue existing. Zana fought with precision and subtlety. Her blade moved in patterns that seemed almost lazy until opponents realized they were already cut. Between exchanges, she wove illusions that attacked the mind rather than flesh. Bane found himself fighting phantom duplicates while the real Zana struck from unexpected angles. The stone courtyard cracked under their feet. Windows shattered from force pressure. The lake's surface rippled as if struck by invisible wind. They fought for 10 minutes, 20, neither gaining decisive advantage, both pushing beyond normal limits of endurance. Sweat mixed with blood from minor wounds. Breathing became labored. Muscles screamed protest. This was exactly what the essence transfer required. Push until defenses collapsed, until mental shields weakened from exhaustion, until the vessel became vulnerable. Then the Jedi arrived. Riskar and Saru Saj appeared at the courtyard's edge, their presence in the Force like beacons of light intruding on darkness. They had expected to find evidence of Sith survival. Instead, they found two Dark Lords locked in combat that defied description. Med was already dead. He had insisted on approaching the dwelling first, attempting peaceful contact before assuming hostility. That naive optimism had lasted exactly as long as it took Bane to sense his presence. The Jedi investigator had died without ever seeing his killer throat crushed by invisible pressure. Raskata assessed the situation with combat veteran's instinct. Two Sith fighting each other. Exhausted, distracted, perfect opportunity to eliminate both. Her twin lightsabers ignited as she charged. Saro Guy followed, his analytical mind already calculating attack patterns and optimal strike points. They were skilled, trained by the best the Jedi Order could provide, experienced in battles that had earned them legendary status among their peers. They lasted 90 seconds. Bane met Raska's charge with contempt that was almost palpable. Her twin blades met his single lightsaber and were battered aside by strength that shouldn't have been possible from someone so obviously exhausted. His free hand gestured and lightning consumed her, cooking flesh inside her robes. She died screaming, her body collapsing into smoking ruin. Saro Z's analytical mind gave him extra seconds of survival. He recognized that close combat was suicide, attempted to use the Force at range, hurling debris and calling lightning of his own. Zana killed him almost casually. An illusion made him perceive the ground as solid where there was actually a gap. He stepped confidently and fell 3 meters onto stones that shattered his spine. Her lightsaber ended his suffering before his Syrian brain could process the pain. 3 Jedi dead in under 2 minutes. Not because they were weak or poorly trained, but because they had interrupted something beyond their comprehension. 2 Sith Lords, at the absolute peak of their power, pushed beyond normal limits by combat that determined their entire philosophy's validity. The interruption had given both combatants brief respite. Now they turned back to each other, and the real battle began. Bane abandoned lightsaber combat entirely, called on the dark side with such intensity that the air itself seemed to scream. Force lightning poured from his hands in torrents that turned the courtyard into an electrical storm. Stone exploded into molten shrapnel. The dwelling's walls cracked and collapsed. Zana met his power with sorcery that attacked reality itself, illusions so powerful they became semi-real, attacking with physical force despite being mental constructs. She showed Bane his own death 1,000 different ways, made him experience the oblivion he feared most, turned his desperation against him like a weapon forged from his own weakness. He fought through the illusions with raw willpower, but each one weakened him, drained reserves he couldn't spare. His body was failing. The technique he'd relied on for decades was consuming him faster than dark side energy could sustain. The essence transfer was now or never. Byrne gathered everything remaining. Every scrap of power, every fragment of will. His consciousness became a spear, aimed at his apprentice's weakening defenses. He could feel her exhaustion matching his own, see opportunities opening in her mental shields. He struck. His awareness slammed into Zana's consciousness like a battering ram against a fortress gate. For a moment, he felt her mind's architecture, saw 20 years of memories, felt the girl called Rain still buried beneath layers of Sith teaching, recognized places where his consciousness could take root and grow, consuming her identity like fire consuming paper. Then she pushed back. Zana's mental defenses, reinforced by a night of meditation and fueled by absolute refusal to be erased, met his invasion with force that matched his own. The battle shifted from physical to purely mental. 2 wills locked in struggle that left their bodies frozen, lightsabers forgotten. In that moment of perfect balance, the outcome could have gone either way. Bane's desperation gave him strength. Zana's youth gave her endurance. His knowledge fought her innovation. His fear battled her determination. The scales tipped by the narrowest margin imaginable. Xana's consciousness flexed, and Bane's invasion collapsed. His awareness recoiled back into his own dying body. He felt his concentration break, felt the dark side abandon him as exhaustion became overwhelming, felt his defenses crumble, and in that instant of absolute vulnerability, he understood that he had lost. Xana's lightsaber moved almost gently, a strike to his chest that pierced his heart. Beam fell, his body hitting stone that his blood had already stained. His vision dimmed. His connection to the Force began to fade. His last sight was his apprentice standing over him, victorious, exactly as the rule of two demanded, exactly as he had always taught her it should be. He died knowing the Sith would survive. That was victory enough. Or perhaps he didn't die. Perhaps in that final moment his consciousness completed the transfer. Perhaps Xana's eyes held his awareness now, wearing her identity like a mask. Perhaps the essence transfer had succeeded after all. No one would ever know for certain. Not even Xana herself could be completely sure. She felt like herself, remembered her entire life. Her thoughts were her own, but how would she know if Bane's consciousness had merged with hers so completely that no seam showed? The ambiguity was perhaps fitting. Let future Sith wonder. Let them fear that their masters might find ways to cheat death after all. The Huntress found her there, standing over Bane's corpse surrounded by dead Jedi and ruins of their battlefield. Lucia had approached cautiously, her precognition screaming warnings about the danger ahead. She had witnessed the final moments through a cracked window, seen power that redefined her understanding of what Force users could achieve. She had come to kill Bane. Instead, she found him already dead, and his apprentice looking at her with eyes that held calculations too complex to decipher. "Your contract is fulfilled," Xana said calmly. "Bane is dead. Set Hearth's credits bought his death, though not by your hand." Lucia nodded slowly. "What happens now?" "Now you have a choice," Xana smiled, and something in that expression suggested depths of knowledge that went beyond her apparent years. Return to hunting contracts, and eventually die forgotten, or accept training that will make you more dangerous than any being you've ever tracked. The Itochi's precognition showed her branching futures. In one path she left and lived decades as a successful hunter, growing old in relative comfort. In the other she accepted and entered a world of power and danger that either killed her or transformed her into something extraordinary. She chose transformation, took the name Cognos, became Darth Xana's apprentice. The rule of two continued. Set Hearth remained hidden, monitoring events through distant contacts. When word reached him of Bane's death, he celebrated briefly before realizing that Xana was now the master, and Xana knew he had fled, knew he was a coward, would eventually decide he represented a loose end that needed severing. He spent the rest of his life running, died decades later, alone and paranoid, never having achieved the power he once craved. His role in Sith history was forgotten almost immediately. The Republic declared the matter closed after discovering the 3 dead Jedi on Ambria. They attributed the deaths to dark side remnants from the ancient sorceress who had once lived there. The idea that living Sith had killed 3 trained Jedi was too terrifying to consider seriously. The Jedi Order mourned their fallen, held ceremonies, and filed reports that no one with authority read carefully. And in the shadows, Darth Xana began teaching her apprentice, continued accumulating knowledge, refined techniques, plotted with patience that would span decades. Eventually she would face Cognos in their own final duel. The victor would take a new apprentice. The cycle would continue. Generation by generation, the Sith grew stronger. Darth Xana to Darth Cognos to Darth Millennial, to others whose names were lost to history. each master teaching everything to their apprentice, each apprentice proving themselves through victory. The lineage remained unbroken. 1,000 years later, Darth Plagueis would teach Darth Sidious, and Sidious would teach Vader. And through them, the rule of two would achieve its ultimate goal. The Republic would fall, the Jedi would be destroyed. The Sith would rule the galaxy openly for the first time in a millennium. All because a miner from Apatros had embraced his darkness completely, had destroyed an entire order of Sith Lords to save them, had created a philosophy that transcended individual ambition in service of something greater. The galaxy slept peacefully, unaware of the shadows that moved through its margins. Ambria returned to silence, its stones remembering violence but revealing nothing. The lake's surface reflected stars that had watched civilizations rise and fall for eons. Somewhere in those shadows, two Sith Lords plotted, patient as the turning of worlds, inevitable as entropy, building toward a future where darkness would reign and the light would finally catastrophically fail. The Sith endured through secrecy and patience, through strength and succession, through the rule of two that began with destruction and would end with domination. Peace was indeed a lie, but from that lie, from the conflict it masked, came the power that shaped a galaxy's destiny. The Jedi believed they had won on Ruusan. In truth, they had merely postponed their defeat. The story of Darth Bane was complete, but the story of the Sith was just beginning, and the galaxy sleeping peacefully under Republic protection had no idea what horrors waited in its future, what patient vengeance was being prepared, what terrible price would eventually be paid for victory celebrated too soon. The darkness gathered, the shadows lengthened, and in the silence between stars where light had never reached, the Sith prepared for their ultimate triumph. One master, one apprentice, two who would become millions under their rule. The rule of two had proven itself eternal,